Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining. So today I want to talk about how to be a humble human. So in seeing the debates over the course of the last week back in the US, and then seeing the president contract COVID, and then some of the commentary surrounding that, it caused me to reflect, and I had some good conversations with colleagues earlier this week on really questioning what it is we value, and then attempting to live that value as best we can. So I wanted to talk about this idea of how to be a humble human. Now, as a humanist, I don't mean humility in the sense of being self-deprecating, where we put ourselves down or don't acknowledge the things that we know that we're good at. That's false humility, in my opinion. If you go back to Aristotle's virtues, humility is the balance between being self-deprecating, putting yourself down, and then being arrogant, right? Or claiming things that you can't actually do. So the middle ground is humility. And so what does that mean in today's world? What does it mean to be humble? Well, I think it means a few things. One of those things is to understand that you don't know everything. There's a saying that I try and live my life by, which is that an educated man knows many things, but a wise man knows nothing. Because all the things you know are based on your assumptions, your biases, the culture that you grew up in. And so it's critical for us to constantly question what it is that we know, right? Science would tell you that you don't truly know anything, but that you have repeatable results that you base assumptions on. And from assumptions, you build your sense of reality. So when it comes to being a humble humanist, and particularly in the context of the political situation we find ourselves in, I want to discuss a few things. A lot of what we see on social media in terms of the quote unquote debating that I would see happening is mostly just people giving their emotional opinion about the current state of affairs. Now, if you've ever been in an argument with someone that's not an actual structured debate, you know that most of those are really emotional arguments. They're not rational. People rarely respond to rational reasoning about their deeply held beliefs, right? You might be able to convince them that one brand of soap is better than another brand based on some scientific formula. But if you're trying to convince them away from some ideal that they hold, some value that is dear to them, that's part of their being, you're going to have a really difficult time. And political questions, particularly in our society and cultural questions, really fall into that category of being emotional. The problem that we have is not that we can't argue emotional topics. That's something that's doable. We'll talk about how to do that. The problem that, particularly as Americans, we love being right. And we really love winning, and we love winning big, and we love winning by a lot of points. And so when we engage in our social media or our daily conversation, and we find someone whom with we disagree, when we put them in their place by using words to make them feel bad, that counts as winning in a lot of people's minds, right? Like that you've scored a point, you've gotten a sick burn on your opponent, and that's you winning. But it isn't, right? And it's difficult to back down from being right, especially because it's so culturally ingrained, right? Whether it's conservative voters wanting to quote unquote own the libs, or the liberal voters wanting to show the deplorables how they're stupid. It's something that feels good, but it's like candy, right? It's enjoyable to consume, but doesn't really do much for you. And a lot of this has to do with this idea of fundamental attribution error. So it's a cognitive bias that we have where we attribute to others their actions to their character failures. Whereas if we were to do something where maybe it wasn't consistent or hypocritical, we would attribute it to some external factor, right? We were having a bad day, right? Basically where we give ourselves more allowances than we give other people. The easy example of this is when you're driving. When you're driving, you always have an excuse for why you cut someone off or why you had to merge quickly. It was usually just because you weren't paying attention. It's not out of malice, right? Never attribute to malice what you can attribute to stupidity or ignorance. But the problem is you don't do the same for others. Anytime someone cuts you off, it's often the case that we start swearing at them and have that sense of road rage because we can't see the other person and see what their emotions are like, what other things they're going through, we just attribute to them that they're a bad person and they cut us off and they shouldn't be driving anymore. So that's one of the things that we have to consider as we go into these discussions, which are critically important for the functioning of democracy, of any democratic society, is that we can't attribute malice to others where we should instead attribute ignorance. The other thing is that you can't win emotional arguments with facts, right? You can list facts up and down till you're blue in the face. And we've seen more recently where facts have become even less persuasive, where we have quote unquote alternative facts, or people simply discard things that don't already conform to their beliefs, right? So it's confirmation bias. And at the same time, again, we tend to see ourselves, whoever ourselves happen to represent, as rational, consistent, or fact-based, right? But those aren't everybody's values. And here's the kicker. Humans are evolved to make rapid decisions with little data. We're not evolved to be highly complex, rational beings. That's more of a modern thing, particularly in terms of moving toward a complex society where we have to get to the point where we write down laws because things are so complex. So emotion is how we make a lot of our decisions, right? We're hardwired to make a quick response because historically, that's the thing that kept us alive. It's the thing that helped us to survive and evolve. Now, this can be overcome with practice, but it comes at a cost, and that cost is significant cognitive energy. Humans are also evolved to be lazy, not in the sense that we don't do anything, but that we want to conserve energy. And so the things we have to overcome are cognitive biases and logical fallacies, things that make it easy to jump to conclusions, which is good if you're a hunter in the wilderness, but bad if you live in a complex society where you need a sophisticated understanding of the system in which you live. Now, there's plenty of research that shows it's much easier to do emotional thinking than rational thinking, but there are also ways to combat it. I have some links that I can throw up in the chat later. And any time that you're wanting to engage in a conversation, your goal should be not to convince someone that you're right and to immediately accept your opinion, but instead to converse with them to better understand their position. And I'll talk specifically through how to do that. But first, I want to point out something about today's modern age. Today, you can never be forgotten. Any act that you do can never be forgotten, especially if it's online, if it's captured on video. There's documentation of almost everything everyone does, and it's only going to get worse with time. That means that where we used to be able to forget something that someone did, now we have to be deliberate about forgiving it. Because when you can never forget, you have to forgive. Otherwise, society will become paralyzed by virtue signaling about something that someone's done 30, 40, 50 years ago that's no longer relevant to who they are today. This is also true of voters and people in our families that we've now written off because they hold some other political view than us. How are we going to get to the point where we can forgive people? Because we need everyone to be a part of society. We can't start shuffling people off into a corner because that corner is going to get really big over time. We have to figure out how to keep people integrated, keep them productive, and keep it where they don't want to fight against the majority or the minority, whatever that happens to be. And beyond that, forgiveness really decreases negative feelings. There's a lot of research on that as well. So for our own sake, let alone for the sake of those that we're forgiving, we have to really practice this activity. So how do you build an influential narrative, one that sways people from their deeply held position? Well, first, in terms of structure, it should generally be one-on-one, right? In that case, neither side can rely on peer pressure or group support to say, yes, I'm right? To live in your echo chamber if you're one-on-one. People tend to be more human and less accusatory in that sort of a structure as well. And then if you're going to tell your story, tell it from your perspective. This is the same kind of thing you do in conflict communication. You don't go in and say, you always, and you never, and you. You say, this is how I feel about this issue. This is how I understand this to be. And when someone says something that you don't understand or don't agree with, ask the question, can you tell me more about that? Because I don't fully understand your reasoning behind it. Use conditional language. Don't back people into a corner. I have never once seen someone win an argument by the first person putting the second on the defensive or making them feel stupid. All they do at that point is shut down, and you've lost. In fact, both sides have lost at that point. Phrase reactions as questions, right? So going back to the example of the car on the highway, right? A lot of times we would be like, check out this asshole for having cut me off, right? So instead of that, check yourself and say, why does that make sense? What might be going on for that person that is the right thing to do? So you have to constantly red team your own thinking to realize how you could be wrong. Be logically consistent, but don't force your logic onto your discussion partner, right? Don't force them to cede, doesn't X follow Y? Allow them to come to that conclusion by leading them through questions. And then once they get to a certain point where you start to feel that they're getting close to being in a corner because they're having to come up against reflecting on their belief, at that point, that's where you let off. You've led them to a point with your questioning, ideally to see that there's some inconsistency in what it is they believe. At that point, the only time people make changes in their own mindset is when they have time to retreat, reconsider, reflect, and then come to that conclusion on their own. I've seen this happen a variety of times with deeply held beliefs. So a friend of mine used to be the bishop over a tri-state region of the Mormon church. And at the age of 60, converted away from Mormonism because of a series of questions one of his parishioners had brought to him. And that person was having a hard time reconciling certain ideas. And so over the course of years, this friend of mine considered those questions and really read into them and researched and found that he also couldn't reconcile those questions, and therefore ended up turning away. Now, if someone had forced him to do that, it would have never happened. So it's something that you have to allow people that time to retreat and reflect. When it comes to having these difficult conversations, words mean things, right? Don't use accusatory words. Try and rephrase them into questions that are about you. I don't understand this. Please help me by giving me some more information. You really have to work on tone. And this is critically important when it comes to social media because tone is very difficult to convey, right? We use a lot of emojis and exclamation points to show like, no, we're just, trying to convey a thought and having fun, whatever it is. But this is why one-on-one conversation is best. And the best thing you can do is show understanding first. This can often be really hard when you have a two-dimensional view of who it is you're discussing something with. Right? If you're on social media and some rando comments on whatever it is that you're talking about in a way that's, accusatory or inflammatory, consider understanding their point first or where they could possibly be coming from. And you've got to often be very generous. This gets back to the idea of humility. How can I be generous enough and humble enough to give them the benefit of the doubt? That they're not a bad person. I'm not going to fundamentally attribute evil to them because of what they're saying. What if instead I gave them sympathy and considered that maybe they haven't had the chance to learn the things that I've learned if you feel you're right. Maybe they haven't had the chance to reflect. Maybe they've lived a privileged life where they don't understand these other issues. And then how do I get them to reflect on what it is that they're thinking or whatever their position is? So this generosity of thought, this is really important. This is true for relationships as well. If we go around thinking that our partners have some ill intent, right? A lot of times we say things and we're lazy about tone and phrasing and whatever it is. And it might seem like we're trying to be offensive, right? Or just inconsiderate. But a lot of times, again, don't attribute to malice what you can attribute to ignorance or stupidity. I know for myself, this happened today with my wife. Like I said things and I said them in a way where I wasn't fully paying attention. And that caused her to think that I was being mean to an extent, right? And so I had to go back to her and explain, like, that was not my intent to convey that offense, right? So to me, it doesn't matter if you meant to offend them or not. Ideally, you don't in the first place. But even if you do, go back and apologize. You don't have to apologize for being wrong, because it's not a question of what right or wrong at this point. It's a question of, if I, offended you, that was not my intent, and I'm apologize for that, because that's not constructive to either of our goals. When it comes to dealing with other people, again, give them the benefit of the doubt. People are generally good. In my travels around the world, from being in Afghanistan, Africa, other places, everyone wants the same things. They want peace, stability, and prosperity for them and their family. That's basically it. So when it comes to Republicans or Democrats or conservatives or liberals, they all want exactly the same thing: a good life for their family. That's a virtue I think that all of us can agree with. So you have to give them the benefit of the doubt that they think that the ideas they're proposing lead to that outcome. Now, they might not be consistent, or they might not be logical, but that's the underlying motivation for most people. There are always going to be some assholes. That's fine. We'll deal with those. But if we start treating everybody like they're an asshole, well, then perception becomes reality and everybody starts acting like one. Whereas if we treat people like they're good human beings, I found that in my experience, people behave as you expect them to behave. You expect them to behave badly, and they will not disappoint. If you expect them to behave well, though, they won't disappoint either. And trust that generally people have your best interests at heart, particularly people that know you. It tends to just work out better. Yes, you'll get taken advantage of a few times, but I would rather have that than be distrustful and build distrust as an expectation into society. So the call to action for today is to go out and have a conversation with someone that maybe you've had a not so productive conversation with in the past. A lot of the best people to start this with are family members, right? And it's not about making them agree with you or forcing them to take your side on things. Again, it's listening to them to understand. Ideally, you can help them through smart questioning, lead them to a place where they realize there's an inconsistency, and then you back off and let them do the work. But you also can't, at the same time, you can't let things that are morally wrong stand. All right. So I had this issue with my dad toward the end of his life. So he was badly injured. He was in really bad shape. He was on a lot of medications that affected how he operated. I mean, he was very stubborn. But as he got older, he got more and more racist, and there's no other way to put it. And it got to the point where I had to start calling him out on it. Like, basically say, like, I don't agree with you. I think that's a completely wrong sentiment, and I prefer you didn't do that. And because we had a good relationship and he appreciated my perspective, he at least respected me for that. And it helped to balance his perspective a bit, because he very much got trapped in sort of a watching TV bubble and listening to one type of channel that helped to inform his worldview. So while we have to be understanding of others, at the same time, we can't simply disengage and say, well, everybody's opinion is valid, because that's not true either. We have to go out, we have to challenge people, but we have to learn to challenge them in ways that allow them to grow. Not all of us were this quote unquote woke when we were born, or when we were teenagers, or when we were in our 20s or 30s, or whatever age we are, right? We gain wisdom, like I said earlier, because we consider things over time, and we allow ourselves to be wrong. We forgive ourselves for having been wrong, and we become better people for it. And if we've given ourselves that opportunity, well, then to me, it follows that we should give others that opportunity. Because if we don't, then we're just as much of a hypocrite as sometimes we claim them to be.